There we go. All right. Hey guys, welcome back to another week of dungeon diving. I'm Kyle. Today with me is Ben, Fia, and I'm not sure. We didn't talk about this. I guess we're just gonna go with two sword for now. Does that work? Okay. Cool.
Sure.
Uh, Today we're gonna talk about first experiences with D&D. So before we get too much into that, I'm going to let Ben kind of go through that a little bit, and then we'll go around and we'll start talking about those things. So,
Okay. So yeah, the impetus for this one is basically we're going to talk about our first D&D experiences. So again, what brought you to the hobby? What kind of drew you in? Whether you were just kind of like walking by a store, you saw a nice poster that said, "Hey, come play D&D." Maybe you had some friends who were like, "Hey, we want to get together with a game." Maybe you were kind of curious about it because you saw Critical Role or some other online streaming service. Maybe ours someday. Other people will be watching and be like, "Hey, D&D, that's a thing." Um, but yeah, stuff like that. What kind of brought you into the hobby? Like what edition did you start on? Maybe some of you have started in one of the later editions. We're in fifth ed now, but there were previous ones, and kind of what drug you into that or stuff like that. Maybe your first character. We'd like to know more about, because everyone kind of remembers their first D&D character, right? Like that's the maybe it wasn't the greatest one, but it was the first one, and maybe the first game you ever played in, stuff like that. Kind of explore our kind of background in the hobby, and kind of share kind of how we've kind of grown since then. So with that kind of structure in mind, we're going to start off with Kyle. We're going to
boy.
see kind of where he started, and how he ended up where he is.
Um, so my first experiences were I grew up in a small like suburban area. My parents very very strict about the types of things that I could and couldn't do, especially as like freshman in high school. So I was one of those like typical D&D and all things associated with fantasy or witchcraft and the devil kind of things. So I couldn't really explore that area until one day, and yeah, I was probably a freshman. I was hanging out with some friends after school, and they were like, "Hey, do you want to come over to my house, and do you want to play Dungeons and Dragons?" And I was like, "You bet your sweet ass I do." Because I knew it was something I wasn't supposed to do, and that was really all that had me interested in it at the time. Didn't know what like it involved or entailed or anything like that. So I went. Um, we played. It was 3.5. It was way too complicated for me as a freshman in high school, who only cared about like fast cars and girls and stuff like that. I was like, this is math. This is just more schoolwork. I don't like this, because I had no idea how to role play. I'd never done it before. The kid that was DMing had no idea what he was doing. Uh, Much like most people that have never played D&D before, he had, I remember, a DM screen that he had made out of cardboard, and he was keeping his notes and stuff behind that, and his notes were literally just like at it, like literally like bullet card notes, and they just said red dragon here and goblins here and this here, and like it was the most unofficial, uh, unprepared thing like you'd ever seen. But we played for 6 hours, um, and while I hated it, it was at that point something about it I really enjoyed. And I don't know if it was just the experience with the friends or just the experience itself. Um, but I So that was my first real experience. And of course, parents talk. Like my parents found out about it through this other child's parents, and they're like, "You're never gonna play it again." I'm like, "Well, I'm gonna play it every week now." So, but I didn't.
Rebellion.
Right, yeah. But I didn't. I didn't play it again for probably 3 years. And then when I did start playing, it was also 3.5. Really, really got hard in on that. Um, and imprinted on 3.5. My first 3.5 character was, like, for an actual campaign, was a mess. Um, didn't know how to do anything, didn't know how to use spells, because I didn't really have anybody teaching me. I just had to learn how to play it on my own. The DM was kind of uh, a jerk, so there was no help there in any way. But yeah, so that was my first real like official experience with like 3.5 or anything like it. Um, but as I got a little bit older, um, I started to hear more and more about fifth edition and like start having some whisperings of playing that. Um, so I jumped in on that, started playing fifth. My first fifth edition character was a gnome barbarian. Um, it was a really cool character. It was a lot of fun, and I played fifth edition with that group for probably about a year, and then uh, life and things got in the way. Moved on from playing games and stuff like that, and then we moved, and that's how we came to meet Ben and some of the other players in the town where we live, and started playing fifth edition again. I think my first actual mildly full length campaign that I've enjoyed the most anyway is the campaign that I joined when I moved here with Ben. But it was a lot of fun. It was one of my first experiences delving deep with a backstory and exploring like uh, other classes other than like just base classes, like getting in with warlocks and stuff like that. So it was really cool. Um, but since then, um, like I had been toying with DMing a little bit at that point, and then once we started playing that, I was like, you know what, this would be cool to like to get in on this more and start DMing this more. So that's really when that kicked off too. So I guess it's kind of my first experience as a whole with DMing and with playing and stuff like that. So, but that's really it for me.
But yeah, no, it sounded like you had kind of a nice arc there. Kind of had that traditional kind of like suppressive early time where we're kind of a little bit of role playing through teen rebellion of sorts, and then kind of laid off for a bit, and then refound it once.
Oh, I should add that other than D&D, I had other role playing game experience, like with Vampire the Masquerade and other things, which is not D&D, but that's besides the point.
Right.
So,
Well, you branch out into other systems. I mean,
yeah,
that's a very common as well.
right.
So
But yeah, no, I guess kind of a more traditional story as far as playing and learning and stuff like that goes. So
all right. Uh, Fia, do you have any? What's your
Uh,
story?
um, I actually consider the true start to my D&D experience to be my my weird fascination with Monopoly as a kid, because
Well, this
I
will be fun.
um, Monopoly is actually banned in our family as a game night option because we, as a family, are so competitive about it. And the fact that a lot of us are like bankers and lawyers ourselves, like it's it's a nightmare to deal with that. And some of the time we take it personally. So as a kid, I only played Monopoly like 3 times, but I loved each and every time because I loved like taking things from people and being like this wretched little banker that just like grabbed things and kept them. Like that just appealed to me. Um, and as the band kind of took place, I didn't really have an outlet for that kind of like goblin like behavior. Um,
so good.
until about 7th grade when I joined drama club. And I noticed that I didn't really feel as fulfilled as I thought I would be in the club. Like, I was excited to be acting, but I wasn't doing anything interesting with it. So a friend of mine happened to be talking to me about D&D at the time. And I approached him and I said, hey, can I try? And he attempted to help me make a character during 7th grade lunch. And I remember this so distinctly. It was a ranger. I think it was a high elven ranger. And she had a criminal background. And my young, stupid child mind thought that proficiency just made me some kind of god with weapons. And
So what edition was this one?
this was all 5th edition.
Oh, 5th then? Okay.
Well,
Yeah.
then you're right. 5th edition proficiencies do make you a god.
Yes, but this was level 1 proficiency.
Oh,
So-
okay. That's different.
Plus 4s
Except
were
+2.
not.
It's that wonderful
not
+2.
significant. Yeah. The highest I could get with +2s is like a +4 bonus to every roll. So nothing. I didn't even roll well. So but after that point I kind of got hooked on the idea of fantasy RPGs. And there was a D&D club at my school. And drama club was kind of put first for me, but I was like, well, D&D club meets on different days, so I can give that a go. And so I went, and we did not start off playing D&D. We started off playing Pathfinder, because according to the teacher, that was easier. And
They were wrong, but
That's neither here nor there, but
but they also only had the materials to play Pathfinder. So there were like 3 large groups of kids. They set each group of kids up as a D&D party, and they gave them preset characters, and I didn't like the idea of being a cleric at the time.
did you just get like last picked as a cleric, or like
I
said,
did. Nobody else wanted to be the cleric, and I was like, oh, well, this must suck. And so rather than play the class that would keep the party alive, I said, hey, I'll try DMing. And that was a bad idea. I almost killed the party right off the bat by setting them up against 9 wolves at level 1. And they nearly murked the barbarian first go. That essentially traumatized me as a DM, and I still have not DM'd since.
oh no.
I've talked about it, but haven't gotten into it. But after that point, I was just kind of like, I was hooked. And from then on, I was like looking for more opportunities to hang out with my friends and just be absolutely ridiculous and wretched fantasy terrorists, essentially. And after a certain point, like the whole group just kind of like dispersed, and there was no like argument or falling out. We just couldn't really meet up as much. And going into high school, that definitely kind of put a damper on things, because now we had to be adults, and drama was still kind of first priority in my head. But I kept reaching out to try and play more D&D with whatever friends I could get. and it was very, very sparse. But then I met a guy in drama club uh, who DM'd very frequently, and I was like, "Hey, can we game? Can we do that?" And we attempted to. Um, I did not make it easy on him because he kept trying to make these interesting one shots, but there was literally nobody else to work with except for me. So it kind of just felt very lackluster, and it wasn't really the same kind of like magic that regular dungeon parties
You
would.
didn't have that group dynamic that.
Yeah, I couldn't really bounce off anybody. It was just me, and that's boring. Um, but I managed to kind of spread my roots a little bit, and I found more people in the club that were actually interested in D&D. And I was like, okay, well, I got these people for you. Let's bring them in. And after a certain point, uh, like we did have something that was looking to be an actual campaign. um, but then it kind of fell through, and nothing was really able to stick together because everybody just was suddenly too busy. And and yeah, that kind of, I took about a year and a half hiatus off of D&D after that point. But then during my senior year, uh, my friend Zach invited me to join what would essentially be his first time DMing with two of our mutual friends that we knew. Um, that really just brought it back. That experience was the bomb. And just being able to completely lose myself in the role play and even the combat itself was just absolutely hilarious. Because like, what can you do when your combat's dry and all you're doing is math? Like, you got to spice it up. And that party also fell through. So after that point, I kind of just had this precedent that, oh, well, D&D doesn't really last for very long. People only ever really make it to level like 6, which doesn't make sense. But I I kept trying to reach out, and I was a very anxious kid, so it was difficult to do that, uh, especially when I find it difficult to speak to people in the real world. Uh, so the only real connection to D&D that I had at that point, after all of the D&D veterans had graduated, was my aunt. Uh, and she is her own D&D mongrel unto herself. Um, but she introduced me to online D&D, and at first I was really, really hesitant, but after a certain point I kind of started getting into the groove of it. I started learning more about Roll20, about D&D Beyond. I started looking for actual accounts that would just let me in. And I managed to meet some of the most fantastic D&D players uh, that I could have ever hoped to meet. And then there's you guys. Uh, uh, after a certain point,
Ouch.
I met Kyle through a one shot with a friend that I met through playing with my aunt. And I don't think either of us remember the one shot.
I do not. I do not recall. I remember the characters vaguely, and that's about it.
Yeah.
Um,
I after a certain point, I just kind of got into a groove of working with specific groups because I knew the dynamic worked. And these groups were lasting for longer periods of time than my older groups. So I was pretty excited about that. And then one day Kyle reaches out to me and says, "Hey, do you want to join a campaign?" And I said, okay. Not doing anything else. And then I came here, and that is my history.
that was
And now you're burning down Skullport.
yeah.
Yeah,
And that was
exactly.
that was strangely enough. It's weird though how you meet players online and can connect with other people that you've never met before. Because I reached out to two people that way because I had played with Fia once, and I was like, we're friends on Discord. I can just go. I can ask her, and so I did. I was just like, hey, I've got this server now. I'm trying to make this successful. You're a good D&D player. Do you want to come play? And it's weird how those little things can just leave imprints there. Really glad that I did, because that was otherwise I don't think we'd have as much fun on Thursdays as we do. So it's really exciting. Also, it was the first recruited member for the Knights Remnant. So, but yeah, that's awesome.
Yeah, no, that was a nice story arc.
Yeah.
That was a nice follow there. Two Swords. How did you get into the game?
Well, I grew up on the North Shore of Oahu in Hawaii, in the middle of nowhere, and so there really weren't, game stores and people playing D&D at school. I had a somewhat similar experience to Kyle in that I went to a Christian school from kindergarten through 8th grade, and my dad I think technically he was an ordained minister, but he was like an old hippie, so he really didn't care that much about religion, except he'd use it as an excuse to try to make me do chores and stuff. But for all his faults, the one thing that he was really into was technology, and he was always building like old school home computers and stuff. And so as a result of him kind of being a nerd, he's a chemist, and so I sort of grew up with science and technology in the home, and eventually that led to me being exposed, even as a real little kid, to lots of really old school role-playing games on computer. It was like Tunnels of Doom and Rings of Doom and stuff like that on the TI-99 4A, and then eventually when I got my Nintendo Entertainment System at the age of 9, way back when, I started out with like The Legend of Zelda, and back then it was Dragon Warrior before they started calling it correctly Dragon Quest. And so, even as a little kid, I kind of got a lot of exposure to role-playing games, and I always really liked them, partially because I was always into math, but also partly just because, the idea of, running around slaying monsters and all this cool stuff was always really fun. I think the first book that I read for pleasure and really enjoyed was The Hobbit. And I still contend that is the #1 best written book of all time. It's this beautiful, succinct adventure story. It has all these amazing elements to it.
This is why Two Sword was brought to the server, for nothing else but The Hobbit.
You know it. But I had learned about Dungeons and Dragons before I had ever seen one of these books. I think it was in like 5th or 6th grade I started to learn that there was a tabletop role-playing game called Dungeons and Dragons. But it wasn't until I think 8th grade or something like that, there was a kid up the street who had some old D&D books that he wasn't using, and he got rid of them in a garage sale. And I think at the time I was going over to try to like buy a bunch of old Atari 2600 games that he had like at the garage sale. and then I saw there were D&D books. So when I procured them, they were like the little leaflet books that you get out of the old red box.
Yep.
So my first D&D experience, I think I was the age of 12 or 13 or something like that, was with the little leaflet books from basic D&D back when elves and dwarves and halflings were races and classes.
So like the old first edition red box, or like one of the republishes around second
Actually, it
ed
was
or AD&D?
before first edition, right?
Oh, it was like the
First edition actually had races and classes. Basic D&D, everything was just, you were like if you were an elf, that was it. You were
right.
an elf.
Yeah.
Right?
That was
you could
effectively
cast
the mage
spells
class, because that was the only class that could cast magic.
No, there was the magic user.
Oh, that's right.
Yeah. And then there was the cleric, right? But then the elf could wield weapons and wear armor and cast spells, right? But that was back when like all the different classes, whatever, had different amounts of experience per level.
Mm-hmm.
Crazy stuff. But yeah, actually, I played basic D&D before I played anything else, and at the time that was like around the turn of the decade, so that was like early 90s. And so the first edition that I actually really got into was second edition D&D. Although shortly after that, I realized that there was a first edition. I went back and bought a bunch of the old first edition books. And I started to realize that Dungeons and Dragons was kind of evolving around that time. That was also around the time that I moved out of Hawaii and moved to California for reasons that we won't get into here, because that's a whole other story. But that was about the time that I first started to play Dungeons and Dragons with, some of my nerd friends from back in high school. I think back then I used to like to try to play lots of wizardy type characters because I was like this short, scrawny little kid, who didn't really have a lot of physical effectualness on the physical world around me, and so I like the idea of using magic. So I played a lot of magic-y characters. And I think I played second edition all through high school. And then when I started to go to college, I kind of lost D&D for a little while. And then I joined up with a group that played in my dorm. And they played second edition as well. So we played second edition. That campaign was this terrible, awful Munchkin campaign. It was horrible. The dungeon master wanted to play a DM PC that was like, so there was like ancients and then gods, and then above them were these ultra gods, and he wanted to play one of those in a campaign with all these mortals, and so he was like driving his own story. It was terrible, and we played for 2 years. And after that, I think I stopped playing for a little while. I didn't have a lot of regular groups to play with. I always kept up with the books. I like third edition a lot. I played a little bit here and there, a couple of one-shots and this and that. I think that was the first time that, I don't know if they called it Adventurers League back then, but there was something like that. I played a couple of those. And then I stopped playing right around 4th edition because I looked at the system and I thought to myself, why is it that a fighter has 50 spells? I thought that was kind of ridiculous. So I didn't really play a lot of 4th, and now that it's 5th edition, I love it.
What about... No, I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
I was going to say, I think I'm right there with you on 4th edition, but we have to be careful because I think Ben covets 4th edition.
Oh, it's fine. It's fine.
Lots of hardcore gamers
That's a different... It's not for everybody, but it was for me. But we'll get to that.
You know what I really didn't like about 4th edition is that everyone would build parties so they could stun lock bosses, and that to me is just like, why?
That was definitely a system issue. Yes, it was definitely a tactical system, and you could game the tactics pretty easily if you knew what you were doing.
So yeah, and I really like intense tactical combat. That's like one of my most favorite things, fighting desperate battles. But I don't know, 4th edition. 4th edition, lots of hardcore gamers really like 4th edition.
How long have you been playing 5th edition?
Since I was playing Next Playtest before 5th edition came out, and then ever since 5th edition dropped, I've been on 5th edition.
Nice.
All of my friends say that I'm like a 5th edition encyclopedia. They never look anything up, they just ask me. But, I mean, I don't know if I can really point the camera over there, but I've got like a huge shelf and a half just of 5th edition books. But I've also got, what else is up there? I got like the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles RPG, the old Palladium
Yeah.
RPG. I've
The
got
old After the Bomb book, and the
yeah, I'm looking at it right now. I can see it.
yep, it's on my
Power
shelf
of
too.
Ali Commando.
I know exactly.
I've got the Robotech Palladium RPGs. I got like some Star Wars RPG, you know, some of this and that. Actually, I started writing my own tabletop RPGs back as early as 9th grade, I think.
Oh, jeez.
I've always been like a game mechanics nerd. I love me some game mechanics, and that's probably what's led me to publish on DM's Guild and this and that. But I love to like write homebrew stuff and write.
I was going to ask that that dragon book that you had out there, was that? Did you do any? Did any of the Council of the Worms books from like second ed influence that one at all? I
Yeah,
hadn't had a
very
chance to
much so.
download it yet to look at it, but it felt
Don't
like
let the,
maybe there was.
Don't let the paywall fool you. It's free
Right.
to download. But yeah, I totally like the Draconomicon and all that stuff. Yeah, I feel like 5th edition really hasn't had any of that yet, and so I kind of wanted to get a jump on that.
It's cool. It's cool.
That's
Really
cool.
But yeah, now, you know, after playing in many year-plus long campaigns and having DM'd a bunch, I don't know if I'd call myself a professional DM or whatever, but you know, I've been running Adventurers League games at the comic store, you know, around the corner and this and that. I love 5th edition. It's so well balanced and well written. Yeah. Anyway, that's me.
That was pretty good. It turns out you and I actually have very similar stories in the grand scheme of things. So for me, I didn't, as far as like nerdy pursuits went in the gaming sphere, it didn't actually start with D&D for me. It started with Magic the Gathering. Was a big Magic player early in my life. So imagine, we'll take you back. The year was 1994. You know, new Magic sets had just started coming out. Like 10 or 11-year-old me was, you know, hyped and ready to start playing. There was a local game store that had opened up that we'd started going to, me and my little brother, and we've been playing cards. And you know, Christmas was, you know, this was the summer. We were all, you know, getting hyped for stuff, and you know, Christmas was, you know, just on the horizon. And so we were like, all right, Christmas list time. What do we want? We want Magic cards. So, you know, farm those out to all the aunts and uncles, all the grandparents, you know, just buy us all the Magic cards, please. And we had my family on my dad's side lives up in the Chicago area, and we really only ever get to visit them mostly for like major holidays, weddings, and funerals. That's about the only time we ever cross paths. But Christmas that year came around, and you know, under the tree was a box waiting, and I was all super excited, tore into it, and my aunt had seen the list. The Magic cards were the thing that I was after, and you know, I love her to death. She's a really nice person, but I guess, you know, when she went shopping, she just missed slightly, and I ended up with the TSR's Encyclopedia Magica Volume 1, which is a list of all of the second edition Magic items, abacus of calculation through dust of blending for D&D. Because, you know, it had magic on the spine, and so clearly that's what I was after.
Just think
according to her.
Think about how bad it could have been, though. She could have
I
come
know,
back
right?
with like how to learn generic Magic 101.
Right, it could have been a book on card tricks for all I know, but
That's what I was thinking you were gonna say.
no, almost dodged that bullet. Could have grown up to do stage shows. It would have been a new different path in my life. But no, so I got this book, and it is all the Magic items ever printed up to that point in 1995. So everything from the early 80s up to then, and it's volume 1, so it's like of 4 volumes. so it only had like A through D. So me and my brother started going through it. We had no idea what it was, other than, clearly D&D was involved, and we had a vague idea that D&D was a thing. We'd hung out at game stores. My friend who got me into Magic was kind of curious into D&D as well, but we'd never really gotten into that particular game at the time. And so long car rides, this became a thing me and my brother did, because driving back and forth to Chicago was like a 3-4 hour proposition anyway, and when you're that young, you're just kind of bored to death in a car. So me and my little brother would crack open this book, and we would just be outfitting characters, because it had armor, it had axes, it had bows, it had daggers, just it had a small amount of weapons, because again, we're only going through D, so all the good stuff in later books. But we had armor, we had bows, we had axes, we had daggers, all the basics, and then all the random other items you could come up with in there. So all of them had gold piece value listed, what their rates are. So we would you get 10,000 gold, outfit a character, and that's what we would do on our long car trips. Is we would just go through the book and be like, well, my character has the armor of invincibility and the gem bow that shoots magical energy at people, these daggers of venom that do these whatever. And the other my little brother would be like, well, my character had, and we would just back and forth for hours on end. And so we this was all the way for about a year of car trips, was just this book and us doing that. And then at one point we were sitting up at the game shop playing Magic, and the D&D guys were up there playing their D&D games, and we were like, well, we know how to play D&D now. Like we've got the book. We've made a billion. We've outfitted a billion characters at this point. We can play D&D, no problem.
I don't know.
And so
I don't know why I find this so funny. I've heard this story once before.
I know, but so I think we just got done watching like Cole the Conqueror or whatever Arnold Schwarzenegger barbarian-esque movie was running through the TV at that time, and I was like, well, I want to play a barbarian with an axe. Like, that's a thing that I can do, right? So we went over to the table. We're like, we're gonna play some D&D, and we sat down, and I was like, all right, well, I already know what I want. I already know all the I need this axe and I need this armor. And they're like, all right, kid, couple of things. One, you don't get any of that. Secondly, this is your level 1, so you don't get any of that. First off, and also barbarian isn't a thing. This is 2nd edition D&D, and we'll make you a fighter. Fighter is what you want, right? And I was like, all right. And they're like, okay, well, what do you want? And I'm like, well, I want an axe. And like, okay, well, then you're playing a dwarf, because dwarves use axes. That's how this works. And I'm like, well, that's, I guess, right? Like, I don't know any better. So we take a good half an hour, 45 minutes to put together, roll up my very first dwarf with an axe. That's all he was. That's all he had going for him. They'd already had a campaign like mid-progress that I was kind of now attached to. Everyone who was playing was probably in their late teens to early 30s. And I was rolling in at like 11. So I was definitely like the annoying kid at the table. Not that I was like being overtly annoying, but like just didn't know what was going on and was like, I'm going to swing the axe at the thing, or, I'm going to run over there and do the whatever. And they're like, yeah, but we've got an actual story that we're working on here. You got to dial it down maybe a little bit. And so I, learned how to play D&D. But so my very first adventure with this character, we were started off, they found me in a dungeon, for some reason, like, they were already in the dungeon. So when they turned the corner, I was there. And I was like, hi, I'm, the dwarf with the axe. I'm here to be your friend and go on adventures with you and all that. And they're like, that's nice. Get in line with the rest of us. We're going to go down the dungeon. And I was like, all right, we're going to do the thing. And as that was going along, we're going along, and the DM was like, hey, you see a thing on the wall over here. And I was like, all right, I'm going to go get it because it's clearly treasure. And he's like, all right, you touch it. Roll your save versus traps. And I'm like, I don't know what that is, but sure. So we roll a d20, and he's like, oh, you failed. You disappear. And I was like, okay, what's that mean? And he's like, well, we'll get back to you later. And then the adventure, I have a feeling he just kind of vaguely put me in timeout. But, so the adventure continued. I was sitting there waiting for them to get back to me. And then eventually they get at the end of their long tunnel, and he's like, all right, you come out, and there's this giant lake of acid, and chained from the ceiling is your dwarf friend above the lake of acid. And there's this drip, drip, drip of acid dripping on the chain that's holding him to the ceiling. And I'm like, oh, well, that's bad, because I'll die if I fall into the acid, right? Like, that's not good. So I look down at, I yell down to my party. I'm like, hey, guys, get me down from here. I don't want to, it's bad. I don't want to be here. And the guy who was in charge of the party, the leader of the party, was like, oh, yeah, we'll get you down. And then he used his magical Exendo staff to break the chain, dropping me into the vat of acid, and then I died. And because it was early, it was second ed, and they were kind of old school gamers, I got to watch my character sheet ripped in half before my very 10-year-old eyes. Which was a little traumatic in its own way. And I was like, so what happens? And like, oh, well, you're dead now. Like, that's how this works. Your character died. And I was like, so my first D&D experience, my character lived less length of time than it took to make him. Which in and of itself was, kind of rough. But I lucked out, because it was a shop that was big enough to have two different games going at the same time. And so I kind of sadly kind of moped my way toward the back of the store where the other game was. And they're like, weren't you playing in the other D&D game? And I was like, yeah, but I'm dead. And they're like, but you've only been playing for 5 minutes. And I'm like, I know. And they're like, oh, well, do you want to play in this game? And I was like, yes. And they're like, all right, well, we don't have time to make you a character right now, but somebody else had made a human fighter or a half-elf fighter or something, and then they just had never come back. So they had a half-elf fighter that used a two-handed sword or something, and they're like, do you want to just be a fighter with a two-handed sword, and we do it that way? And I was like, well, I kind of want an axe, because I just watched Call the Conqueror or whatever, and that guy's got a big axe, and that's the thing I'm hooked on at the moment. I'm like, oh yeah, that's fine. So they just kind of erased two-handed sword and wrote big axe on the weapon line, and they're like, and now you have a character. So it took all of 2 seconds, and then I played in that game for 4 years.
Oh wow,
nice.
Yeah.
That was that character stayed with me for a very long time, and so that was and then being in that group, we dove into, we had many other campaigns, many other games at the shop. We did a lot of second ed stuff. There was a bunch of first ed stuff that we kind of went back to. Some of the older players who had a lot of their first ed stuff. We did a lot of Thieves Guild stuff or Thieves World stuff. Bunch of the what was the other one? There's a lot of old second ed stuff that we played around with, but I bought a lot of that material. Played in a lot of those games. Eventually, with the purchase of TSR by Wizards of the Coast, they moved into the third edition era. That particular system did not grab me as hard. There were just too many weird changes, and the feed system and various others just kind of led to a lot of weird trap options that didn't quite speak to me. So I played during those times, but I kind of had dialed back a bit. But then 4th edition came around, and it was a new take on the system. It cleaned up a lot of stuff, I thought. For the very first time ever, a new player could come to me and say, "Hey, I'm a 9th level wizard. What level magic could I cast?" And I could look at them in the eye and say, "9th level magic, because you're a 9th level wizard." And it was a lot smoother in that respect. So my wife had gotten into D&D at that point a little bit. I had started running games for my friend group at the time. We had a lot of campaigns going that way. Eventually, though, that group kind of started moving away, and it got harder and harder to kind of get games running at any given time. But then, near the end of the 4th Ed era, they started doing like in-store promotional play stuff a little. Wizards started bulking up on their in-store promotional play. So you had like the Lair Assaults and the various other in-store play programs. And I had a lot of friends get together for those. And I think one time we had a really, really entertaining time where my wife and I made Vampire was a class in 4th edition that kind of you could be a race, and then Vampire was just your class, and Pixie was a race. So we had Vampire Pixies, a pair of them, that went around causing all manner of trouble.
Mosquitoes.
Yeah, little mosquitoes. We had great times. But so there was that, and then on top of that we had just all a huge campaign that I had built with my friends over time. But as 4th Ed kind of wound down, the 5th Ed program at the shop needed to be kind of built up, and we were kind of running really low on DMs at that point at the shop, as DMs are always a hot commodity. And so I was like, well, I guess I'm going to end up running the D&D Encounters program for the shop for, just to get it off the ground and rolling. And I kind of formed a group together that would kind of like be the base start for that. And then as adventures kind of, as more people, got into the store, and we had enough to kind of like split the group and be like, all right, now you have another table running, and then just kind of build from there. And for a while, the in-store play program was pretty healthy because of that. But outside of D&D, like all of I pretty much have touched most of the main RPG settings. We've done all the White Wolf stuff, the old Deadlands game, even the old Star Wars game, 7th Sea, the After the Bomb stuff. My library is pretty well stocked with all kinds of books for stuff like that. But yeah, no, of the various editions, like I said, I was very, very comfortable in 2nd Ed. It's kind of what I grew up in, so I'm very, very familiar with how all that runs. Like I said, I can play 3rd edition, but again, it just didn't quite grab me. I was a big fan of 4th edition. There was a lot that I liked with it. It did have its flaws in places, but it fixed a lot of things that all of the systems across the board
It was all
needed.
flaws. Don't lie.
No, it was not all. They took a lot of things from 4th to fix it into 5th, and it worked out really well. A lot of lessons were learned to make 5th as good as it is. But no, I like 5th edition. I like how easy it is to get characters up and running for people, especially the early levels. It's very straightforward and kind of smoothed down so that a lot of people can get into it. I like that because of the popularity of online streaming, now you can get a bunch of people seeing D&D and getting interested in it and playing D&D. It's pretty good all the way around nowadays. I think D&D as a just a whole is in a very good place. And I'm kind of looking forward to see where we go from here. There's a lot of settings older settings that I would like to get my hands on at some point that just haven't made it to 5th edition yet.
It's awesome.
Like Dark Sun.
Oh yeah, I'm waiting for that Dark Sun book any day now.
I'm personally waiting for Dragonlance.
I mean, yeah, you'll get that before we get Dark Sun.
That's fair.
Likely.
It's highly likely you will see a Dragonlance book in like the next year or two.
I look forward to it. I hope.
The problem we have is that Dark Sun has psionics, and Wizards of the Coast has had a terrible track record with psionics.
Yeah, they took it out after 2E.
Right.
Yeah.
But anyway, so yeah, that's our backgrounds. We've I think we've had a pretty decent mix here. You know, Kyle and Fia, you guys kind of in the newer spectrum of getting into the game, and Twin Swords and I have been around for ever. It sounds like.
Yeah. It's really cool though to see you know, people like kind of come back to the, you know, the whole, like, those things stick with you. It's really neat to see people on both sides of the spectrum come together as a whole, and see the kind of things that you know, got us all started and what brought us all together at this point. I still think that that's 100% crazy. I could safely say if it hadn't been probably been for the experiences that I had in your campaign, plus maybe one other person, I don't know if I would be DMing at all, honestly. I don't know if any of this would exist, because I just had such a enjoyable overall experience with a player at your game. I don't know that I would have done any of this. So, thanks for that.
Well, I'm glad it worked out.
It did. It did. Again, there's been many times in between there where I've been like, I don't want to do this, but I wouldn't give it up for anything now. You know what I mean? It's a lot of fun. I'm addicted to it. It's like drugs, but better. It's more expensive.
It is.
That's a
but at least you get to keep a lot of it. It's not like consumable.
That's fair. I was gonna say that's a whole different segment. But D&D as a whole is probably more expensive as a hobby than like most things. I feel like when a book's $50 a pop, that's
right. Now they've tried to start making it a little more affordable. Like, I've noticed more stuff is sitting out there for free on like the basic rules compendiums than I'm used to seeing.
Okay.
But yeah, like they definitely have figured out the kind of freemium model where they're like, here's all the basic stuff, but it's not as pretty to look at. You want to buy this $50 book. Like, it's much better.
Yeah.
You'll enjoy yourself much more if you spend $300 on minis. We promise.
Right. And unfortunately, like, this particular system, they went away from minis, which makes their need to buy minis a lot hard. Like, I got it when we were playing 4th Ed, and it was like, well, you need all the minis. Like, you have to have them. You're playing on a grid on a table. Like, you need all the minis. That's where my mini collection came from. Was I had bought a bunch of the minis to, you know, just to supplement my D&D habit. Was I needed monster minis, I needed, you know, character minis, and then it turned out at some point that they actually had like a miniature, like a D&D minis, you know, game that you could play, like a little tabletop, actual, not role-playing version, that you could do like little miniatures combat with. And because I had bought so many miniatures for my game, I actually had enough to field like a lawful evil army. So I was like, well, I guess I'm playing D&D minis now. I guess now that I've got enough of them, I guess I'm buying for a secondary habit to go along with this one.
It's true.
And then it just kind of spiraled from there.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's nice when your drug habits work in synergy.
Right. They're getting back into it now because Magic the Gathering's got that Forgotten Realms set coming out here in a week or two. And We're gonna get that cross promotion all over again.
Yeah, they're gonna release their second Magic D&D book this year.
Yeah, the Strixhaven one's coming out too.
I only want.
Actually, this will be their third one, because their first one was Ravnica. Their second one was the Theros book.
Oh,
and
that's
so
fair.
this will be our third one.
Oh.
I always forget about Theros, and I don't know why.
Yeah,
There's
most people do.
there's some good stuff in there.
It was a cool expansion, but like the world itself isn't what I would build a D&D adventure world around.
Well, I mean, because it's so closely based on Greek mythology, I
Right.
think most of us just sort of associate it with that.
Yeah.
But yeah, no. The hobby, it has its ups and downs, but the hobby as a whole, amazing. I wouldn't change any of it, any of the character experiences or first experiences that I've had. I'm sure, like, not all of you would say the same thing. I mean, maybe I wouldn't try and play with like pre-First to Dead pamphlets, but that's the only thing I would change probably. So, but other than that, I think it's really cool.
Actually, somebody the other day offered, wanted to know if I wanted to run a second ed D&D game for them online.
Oh gosh! And you said,
I was like, well, I have the technical like ability to do all of that, but like, why?
I ran a first edition game about 4 or 5 years ago. The group that I was playing with pretty heavily, what we'd do is we'd kind of rotate, like one person would run, their game like on one story arc, and then, so they didn't burn out, the next person would DM theirs, and we kind of go on rotation. But one of our buddies, Kevin, he's like, let's play first edition. I'm like, okay, I'll run that. And oh boy, is it a mess compared to 5e.
Right.
And to touch on one of your points, Ben, I think kind of we're in a golden age of gaming now, because 5th edition is just this easy to pick up, but, like,
oh yeah,
not laden with all the old school
first and
nonsense.
second edition were so dense with tables and like numbers that went opposite directions for no good reason.
Crazy specific rules for all these oddities.
And it was just one of those deals where I was talking to somebody the other day, and they're like, "Oh man, back in the day, first and second edition was." I'm like, no. That we have moved. Like, gaming technology has evolved so far, and we have solved all the problems from before. Like, I can go back. I know how, but I don't want to. Like, we have
changed. I promise.
Right.
Evolved.
Yeah.
We're better now.
Yeah. But no, I think
Like, things have gotten better.
yeah, for sure. I like 5th edition a lot. I wouldn't go so far as to say I love it. I wouldn't say I'm obsessed with it. I would say it is enjoyable and that it is a very good module to learn on, especially if you're a new player that's never played D&D before. I mean, like, look at the spike in players over the last 2 years. You know what I mean?
Right.
Everyone has been learning to play 5th edition D&D, or has a desire to learn to play 5th edition D&D, which also brings up a point, because I think, Ben, you and I have decided that at some point on the Discord server, you're going to run like maybe a few games that are just pre-generated level 1 characters for people that don't have much.
I've got the characters generated up for them already, so we just got to figure out, like, scheduling wise how we want to do that.
Cool. So if you're watching this, or you will watch this later on, and you're new to D&D, or if you've never played, feel free. There's a link to our Discord server on our Twitch page. Go to that. Come hang out with us, interact, come sign up to play some D&D and learn. It'll be a great time, I guarantee you. Ben is a great DM. I can 100% vouch for everything that he will do. It will be a good time and you'll enjoy it. Other than that, I don't have anything else. You guys have anything you want to add?
No, I mean, as a quick aside, just as an example, I do enjoy how easily second ed stuff translate to 5th ed for anyone who's interested.
Oh dear God.
So like just opening up to one of the bows in the Encyclopedia Magica here, since it's in front of me. There's a gem bow that you can get, made by halfling mages to overcome their enemies a long time ago. But it's basically just a +1 bow. So far so good, easy to do in 5th ed. But you can put a gem in the pommel of it, in like the little above the notch there, and it will give it a elemental damage type and add some elemental damage to it. So like if you put a diamond in there, it does like a like lightning damage. It throws like an extra 10 lightning damage onto the attack. If you put a ruby on there, it's like another 10 fire. And if you put like a sapphire, it's another 10 gold. And every shot you take basically eats 200 gold piece value from the gem until the gem disintegrates. You can put that in 5th edition today, and it would be completely balanced. But this is like an old 2nd ed magical item. Like,
look, I know what Two Sword and Fear are thinking, and no, you will not be getting that. No, I'm just kidding.
I mean, look, Kyle, it's a really good way for DMs to eat through party treasure.
And it's also a good way for parties to eat through their own treasure if they have
Right.
spending it.
Right. Like, guess what? All that gold they're spending, they got to buy gems now, and those gems, they're turning into dust.
Yeah, that's fair.
This is how you get parties to waste their gold, Kyle.
We'll talk after this stream.
But the best part about 5th edition is not just magic items. You can convert old modules and stuff. That's why, like,
super easily, yeah.
Yeah, all the dungeons from Tales of the Yawning Portal are so great, right?
Yeah, but no. All right, guys, we're gonna wrap this up for today. Thank you guys so much for watching. Thank everybody, Ben, Fia, Two Sword. Thank you guys for being here and hanging out and sharing your stories with us. Thank you, chat, for coming and hanging out. Keep plugging away, I guess, at that followers list. We're like 7 away from 50, so that's a giveaway time, and it's going to be a pretty kick-ass dice set. It's from Wormwood, so it'll be pretty snazzy. So we'll see you guys next time. Hope everybody had a great 4th of July. See you later.
See ya.
Bye.
Bye.